5 minutes passed, and Blue remained in the same position he'd began, eyes darting the shallow waters for the glimmer of a scale or a fin. 10 more minutes passed, and Blue shifted his weight to the other leg, wiping his brow and readjusting his grip on the spear. Then the rigid man waited, and waited, and waited. When Blue finally did see a small fish about the size of his hand, he excitedly threw the spear along with his entire body weight at the water, desperate for the chance at a catch. He flew face first into the waves, shattering the peaceful silence and sending water and foam flying. Blue's head broke back through the surface, and he found that his spear had been cracked in half and his hands held no fish. He sat in the shallow water, soaked, as he watched the pink and orange fish meander away. The water around him settled again as he brooded hungrily. This was not an efficient way to fish, thought Blue. After resharpening his stick and trying for another 40 minutes unsuccessfully, Blue decided to return to the lighthouse and make do with the nuts and berries that he'd found. They would hold him over for the time being, but he knew that he'd have to find something more sustainable soon. As he sat outside on the front steps of the lighthouse eating his dinner, Blue found his mind wandering again to the lonely path that he'd woken up on the day before. How did he get there? Was there someone back the other way who could tell him who he was? Had someone brought him there? He looked out at the darkening sky as he placed a handful of berries onto his tongue, savoring their sweetness. Their thin skins burst in his mouth as he chewed, juice trickling down his throat. Blue wondered if there was food down the path he hadn't chosen. He imagined another city or a small town with shops and butchers, bakeries and merchants with gold coins. He finished the nuts in his hand and felt his stomach rumble again, unsatisfied. Blue was nervous to go back. He didn't know how he had gotten on the path in the first place. Fear coiled around Blue like a snake, tethering him to the concrete stoop. The sun was setting now, and the tired man yawned as he sat in its warm orange light. It had been a successful day of cleaning, foraging, and planning. The lighthouse nearly sparkled. Blue stood, dusting off his hands and taking one last look at the sea before it melted into the black night sky. He walked a loop around the edge of the forest before heading once more to his lighthouse for the night. As he walked, he glanced over at the fresh grave that he'd made that day and at the small handful of blue hydrangeas planted beside it. Blue grabbed the heavy wooden door from inside the lighthouse and began sliding it against its frame. The final rays of the sun shone through the narrowing crack as he pulled it closed. With barely a couple of inches to go, Blue noticed a flurry of movement, a wave of crimson fabric between the branches of the tree line to his right. He squinted, stopping the door where it was, and he watched. But just as quickly as the strange flowing fabric had appeared, it vanished. Blue lingered there another moment before shrugging and shaking it off as a trick of the evening light. When it was dark and the moon had risen, Blue sat inside, contemplating the black and blue shadows of his lighthouse. There were so many strange and mysterious things around the woods. Without someone else to share in his experience of the unknown, Blue wondered how he would decide what was real and what wasn't. The small man lay atop his small pile of leaves, pondering his isolation. Tomorrow, he decided, he would go back to the path. Blue had strange dreams that night. In the first, he was in a grand carriage being pulled along by two white horses. Their hooves clopped against the cobblestone streets as they carried him along past the crisp white houses that lined the block. Pretty little things with black shutters and porch gardens. After a while, the cobblestone street turned to dirt. Blue watched himself in the dream as the sky turned a pale green. A sickly fog settled over the houses and the carriage. As he looked out of the window, the people walking in the streets beside him suddenly began to change. As the clouds darkened, so too did their moods, their faces. Blue watched as the throngs of people turned to mobs, suddenly drunk with an inexplicable rage. He sat in the carriage as the violent hands began tearing at its doors and windows. A fierce and wild shrieking filled the air as Blue looked over to see the white coats of the horses streaked with blood, their hooves trampling the red and muddied earth. Their black eyes bulged as ragged fingernails clawed at their combed and perfumed manes. The carriage rocked and groaned as Blue waited, eyes wide. In his second dream, Blue was standing in a large clearing surrounded by trees a few hundred feet away. There were oak trees and willows and great big redwood trees that dwarfed him as he stood alone in the center with roses at his feet. He turned around, staring at the silent giants looming against the night sky. As he did, he noticed that the trees were closing in around him. He spun around again, and to his terror, the trees were much closer than before. They were stalking him. Before he knew it, the circle of trees surrounded him on all sides. Blue tried to run between them, but when he did, another sapling would sprout forth from the empty space in the earth, galloping up towards the heavens at a sickeningly unnatural speed. He spun around frantically as the ground trembled beneath him. 50 feet, 100 feet, 400 feet high, the trees craned upwards, blocking out the sky and the stars with their trunks. Blue looked up to see a brown web of branches and leaves crashing against each other, chunks of bark raining down onto his head and arms. He opened his mouth to scream, but the trees overwhelmed him, branching down his throat and shuddering him in the dark. Sweat, heartbeat, breath. Blue awoke in a swamp. His clothes were damp with sweat against the cool lighthouse floor. He sat up, heart pounding, as he tried to remember where he was and where he'd just been. The sun had yet to rise, and the air was still in the tall, dark room. Blue stood and began walking around its circumference, pacing. When relief did not come, he pushed aside the door and walked down to the river. He stood under the moonlight, letting the waves lap against his ankles and the tops of his feet. Above him, the lighthouse bulb spun around slowly, droning on in the night. The residue of his dreams, so potent only a moment ago, was beginning to fade. Images drifted from his mind, but the feelings persisted, mysterious and heavy. Blue was tired of the bad feelings. He needed a distraction, and so, without another thought, he grabbed his handmade satchel of nuts and berries and set out to find the path, making sure to secure his lighthouse before he did. The morning light peeked up over the surrounding hilltops, spilling into the valleys and onto the narrow dirt path that Blue followed. He'd been walking a little over an hour now, and the lighthouse was well behind him. To his left, the forest rose up, dark and mysterious, behind the jagged tree line. Morning dew clung to the branches and leaves, making them droop under the added weight. To his right, the river flowed back towards the lighthouse. He meandered down the trail, popping nuts and berries into his mouth as he took in the scenery. Before he knew it, Blue had come to a small patch of grass that overlooked the water beneath the shade of a tree. From here, He could see the lighthouse in the distance below, and he thought that this would be a good place to stop and get his bearings. He turned to his right and then to his left, scanning the area. The sun was warm against the back of his neck. He walked down to the water and splashed his face in the shallows. When he did, he looked to his left and saw something overgrown in the bushes. Blue walked over to the small trio of bushes, blinking and shading his eyes. He bent down, using his hand to brush aside a tangle of roots and muddied leaves. When he did, it revealed a cracked wooden sign underneath. Once he'd brushed it off completely, he was able to read the word Crete carved in bold, practical letters. Blue lifted the rotted wood to get a better look, revealing a swarm of maggots and worms underneath. He frowned, dropping the sign, which landed on its side, broken. Blue looked down and saw another small carving in the wood, this one crude and fairly well hidden between the cracks and grooves. In tiny scrawled letters it said, "Follow the road of knowledge." Blue looked in the direction that the sign had been facing. The road turned a small corner before narrowing and then twisting off into the tree line. Beyond that, the forest was too dark and thick to see anything. Blue stood, slowly inching towards the dark trees. He thought of the journals in the lighthouse and remembered the strange entry that he'd found. Follow the road of knowledge to find the city's key. He got the sudden image of being swallowed up and suffocated by the trees around him. Their crusted bark tore his thin flesh, filling his throat and lungs. Blue clenched his fists, looking up at the white mountains rising over the sea of wooden giants. He thought of his empty lighthouse and of his hunger. Then he walked into the forest.